Welcome to Discovering God's Word, chapter by chapter. I am Elliot Ham, and I will be your host for this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for our study of God's Word. I am so glad you have joined me this week as we continue our study through the book of John. Have you ever tried to describe a sunset to someone who has never been able to see it? There's an old story about a blind boy whose eyesight was restored by specialists. While heading home, looking at the world for the very first time, he asked his mother why she had never described all of the beauties of nature and the true loveliness of her face. The reality is, words are simply unable to picture what personal eyesight can instantly reveal. Today, as we step into John chapter 9, this is where Jesus encounters a man who lived in total physical darkness from birth. But as we dig into the text, we quickly realize this is not just an account about physical eyes being opened. It is a beautiful yet challenging look at a much deeper recovery, our own spiritual sight. In this chapter, Jesus makes a profound declaration. He says, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." As we dive in, let's reflect. Are we opening our eyes to His truth? Or are there areas which we are willfully choosing to remain in the dark? Let's take a close look at the text. In verse 1 beginning, as Jesus is passing by, fleeing an angry crowd, he stops to notice a beggar blind from birth. The disciples quickly ask, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This was a common reaction, naturally wanting to link pain directly to personal guilt. However, Jesus beautifully shifts their perspective. He answers neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Our deepest trials can become the very places where divine grace shines. Jesus emphasizes the absolute necessity of doing the Father's work urgently while it is still day, leaving us with the beautiful, enduring promise, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world," Jesus says. In verses 6 and 7, we see Jesus who spit on the ground, made clay, and anointed the blind man's eyes. He then commands this man to go wash in the pool of Siloam. It's a profound test of faith. The man simply obeys. He goes, he washes, and he comes back seeing. True spiritual sight begins with pure obedience. Now, beginning in verse 8, imagine seeing this familiar blind beggar now walking with perfect sight. That is the shockwave hitting this community. The neighbors are completely bewildered, arguing over his identity, wondering if it's truly him or just some look-alike. The man quickly settles the dispute with a simple statement. He says, "I am he." When pressed by the curious crowd about his eyes, how they were opened, he gives a beautifully direct and factual testimony. He explains that a man called Jesus made the clay, anointed his eyes, and told him to wash in Siloam. When they ask where the healer is, he honestly responds he didn't know. It makes us ponder how easily we can dismiss the incredible blessings that may be happening right before our very lives every single solitary day. Beginning in verse 13, we see the Pharisees have started an investigation. The neighbors bring the formerly blind man to the Pharisees, whom they respect as religious guides. This sets up an immediate controversy because Jesus performed this miracle on the Sabbath day. When asked how he received his sight, the man explains very simply, "He put clay on my eyes and I washed and I see." This triggers a sharp division within the leadership. One legalistic group claims this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Yet another group questions, how can a man who is a sinner do such miracles? When asked for his estimation, the healed man says he is a prophet. Suspecting a hoax, the rulers summon the man's parents. They ask the parents, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" The parents confirm his identity, but fearfully pass the buck regarding the healing itself. They reply, "He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself." This cowardice is driven entirely by severe intimidation. They knew the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed Jesus as the Christ, they would be cast out of the synagogue, a devastating social and religious exile. The Pharisees recall the beggar, commanding, "Give God the praise, we know that this man is a sinner." This man completely diffuses their theological pressure with an iconic testimony. He says, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." When they keep badgering him, he asks with sharp irony, "Do you also want to become his disciples?" Furious, the Pharisees revile him, boasting, "You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple." They dismiss Jesus, declaring, "As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." The healed beggar beautifully turns the tables, delivering a powerful scriptural defense. He notes how marvelous it is that these educated leaders do not know where Jesus is from, yet he opened his eyes. He reminds them, "We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him." He concludes, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Out of options, the prideful Pharisees resort to raw abuse, shouting, "You were completely born in sins, and you were teaching us?" They then officially cast him out of the synagogue. As the chapter comes to a close, when Jesus is now hearing that the Pharisees have done this, he intentionally seeks this man out. Physical healing was just the beginning. Jesus now addresses his deep spiritual need, asking the man, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" The man asks who the Messiah is so that he may place his faith in him. Jesus openly reveals his identity. "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." Instantly filled with faith, the man confesses, "Lord, I believe," and worships him right there. Jesus then explains the spiritual climate. "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who may see may be made blind." Overhearing this, nearby Pharisees sarcastically asked, "Are we blind also?" Jesus responds that because they arrogantly boast we see, their sin remains. This week from John chapter 9, here's a few applicable lessons that we can learn. Lesson 1. Suffering is not a sign of divine anger. Physical hardships, disabilities, and personal tragedies are not arbitrary punishments from God for specific sins. When the disciples encountered the man born blind, they immediately looked for someone to blame. They asked who sinned, this man or his parents. The question stemmed from a deeply ingrained misconception that personal suffering is a direct punishment for sin. But Jesus completely shattered that premise. He responded, neither the man nor the parents, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Instead of a calculating formula between sin and pain, Jesus reframes our hardships as platforms where God's grace and God's power can be actively displayed. A truth heavily backed by the book of Job and Luke chapter 13. Now let's make some application. Stop playing judge. When someone encounters a sudden crisis, it may be a medical diagnosis, maybe financial ruins, maybe it's a family tragedy. We have to completely abandon the toxic urge to assume that they are being punished by God. Shift the focus to helping. Instead of wasting time overanalyzing why bad things happen to people, our true responsibility is to find tangible ways to assist and to comfort those who are hurting. And look for the platform. When we face our own personal trials, we can ask God for wisdom, seeking ways to use the endurance to produce patience, to build spiritual strength, and ultimately bring glory to Him. Lesson 2. True faith requires active obedience. Believing in God is empty without a willingness to explicitly follow His instructions. even when they may not make sense to us. Jesus did not heal the blind man instantaneous with a simple word. Instead, he chose a method that served as a direct test of the man's active faith. He anointed the man's eyes with clay made from dust and saliva, and gave him a condition to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The physical clay itself had no natural medicinal purposes to cure lifelong blindness. The true power rested entirely in the command of Jesus. Because the man did not scoff, he did not balk at this unusual request, but instead he completely met all of the prescribed conditions. He came back seeing. Passing a test of faith requires passing the test of active obedience. Here's the application. Avoid selective obedience. We cannot expect to experience God's promises, spiritual sight, or true salvation if we only follow the commands that we feel comfortable or logical to us. All conditions set by God must be met completely. We also need to act despite the mess. Sometimes doing what is right requires walking by faith through some uncomfortable and maybe even bizarre circumstances. We must be willing to act on God's word before we see the final blessings. And lesson 3. Intellectual pride blinds us to the truth. The greatest barrier to receiving spiritual light is the arrogant assumption that we already see it perfectly. Throughout the text, a sharp contrast is drawn between the uneducated beggar and the scholarly religious leaders. The beggar had zero theological training, yet his simple and honest evaluation of the facts led him to declare if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Conversely, the Pharisees were elite scholars. They had direct, undeniable evidence of a miracle staring them right in their face. Yet because of their deep-seated pride, jealousy, and rigid human traditions, they willfully chose to remain in complete darkness. When they sarcastically asked Jesus, "Are we blind also?" Jesus delivered a fatal verdict. He told them, "But now you say, 'We see,' therefore your sin remains." Their fatal flaw was not an inability to see the light, but a conscious desire to reject it. Now let's make some application. Spiritual maturity requires an attitude of ongoing humility. The moment we assume that we're completely righteous, or we look down on others as inferior, we trap ourselves in our own spiritual arrogance. We need to expect worldly opposition. If we choose to take a firm stand for the truth of Jesus, understand that we will likely be mocked, slandered, or even ostracized by an arrogant world that resents the light. Like the beggar healed, let your response be an unshakable adherence to what you know to be the truth. This week from John chapter 9, here's a few questions to think about. Question 1. The cost of the light. Where do we stand alone? Look at that sharp contrast between the healed man's parents and the man himself. When the pressure mounted, the parents fearfully shifted the responsibility away. They said, "He is of age, ask him." They did this entirely out of fear, knowing that anyone who confessed Jesus would be put out of the synagogue. Left completely alone now, their son was cast out. Yet it was in that exact isolation that Jesus found him and revealed his full identity. When we face social pressure or the fear of disapproval in our own circles, do we act like those parents? Protecting our own comfort by passing spiritual responsibility off to someone else? Or are we willing to stand alone for what is right, recognizing that worldly rejection is often exactly where Jesus meets us most intimately? Question 2. The danger of we see. What are our blind spots? Consider the sobering warning Jesus delivers at the end of this account. When the Pharisees sarcastically asked, "Are we blind also?" Jesus gave them that crushing verdict. He said, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say we see, therefore your sin remains." Their intellectual pride was their spiritual undoing. Because they confidently assumed they already had perfect sight, they willfully closed their eyes to the light of the world that was standing right in front of them. Where in our own spiritual lives are we currently blinded by the comfortable, proud assumption that we already see everything clearly? What subtle sins or spiritual blind spots remain in our hearts simply because we are too proud to admit our spiritual need and welcome His transforming light? This week from John chapter 9, I have a challenge for us all. Let's step out in active obedience this week. Be willing to take action, to obey God's instructions completely, even when the path ahead doesn't make immediate sense. Jesus did not restore that blind man's sight instantaneously. Instead, He spit on the ground, made clay, anointed the man's eyes, and issued the command to go wash. Think about the sheer grit that this required. This man had to navigate busy streets while completely blind, mud smeared over his eyes entirely on a promise. It did not make natural sense nor medical sense, but he didn't scoff, he didn't argue, and he did not hesitate. The text tells us, so he went and washed and he came back seeing. The challenge for us is to stop waiting for a perfect, completely comfortable, logical blueprint before we finally decide to move. Real transforming faith requires active obedience. When God gives a condition, we have to meet it fully, not just the parts that are convenient. If we want to see the victory, we have to be willing to do the walking. Step out, embrace the messy process, follow His word explicitly, and watch the darkness clear away. As we close our study this week in John 9, let the unshakable testimony of a once blind beggar echo in our hearts, when he said, "One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." Jesus did not just step into this man's physical darkness. He came to shatter our spiritual blindness. He remains our ultimate hope, our guiding anchor, promising us, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. No matter how dark your current season feels, your struggles are simply the platform for God's incredible glory to be displayed. Shake off the fear, step out in obedience, and walk boldly in His truth. Go out and carry His brilliant light into the world. I would like to thank you all so much for listening again this week. I pray that you will join me again next week as together we discover God's Word chapter by chapter. Have a great week.